Good afternoon. Welcome to our Ancient and Medieval World History Lectures. We're going to talk today about the aftermath of Chinggis Khan's conquests in the 1200s and 1300s, and what the wake of conquest brought for the Mongol Empire and the Kingdom of China. As we mentioned in our last lecture, Chinggis Khan died in 1227, having built an enormous territorial empire that stretched from northern China in the east all the way to Persia and Russia in the west. This is the largest territorial space that had ever been ruled by one single government. And like a number of other historical empires, such as the early Persian Empire or the early Arab Empire, it had arisen in a very short period of violent military conquest. The Mongol conquests became synonymous in world history with undiscriminating terror. That terror was used as a strategy by Chinggis Khan and his generals to try to deter resistance in some of the cities they assaulted by making examples of populations that resisted them. And enormous numbers of people died as a result of Chinggis Khan's conquests. And as we mentioned, the Mongol Empire that followed that conquest was not particularly well organized. And in fact, the Mongol Empire is going to be relatively short-lived as an imperial phenomenon in world history. It's really only going to last for about a century and a half after Chinggis Khan's death. And that's lasting as not as a unified state, but as one that immediately is broken down into multiple kingdoms ruled by Chinggis Khan's descendants. Now, the Mongol Empire is stitched together by a mounted messenger system, as we've seen in earlier empires going back to Achaemenid Persia. This helps them establish rapid communications between the outer regions and the leaders of the empire. However, what the Mongol Empire lacked, again, was a well-organized province system. And in fact, the Mongol conquerors are fairly content, after the immediate killing and destruction dies down, to let local subject elites in northern China, in Central Asia, and in Persia essentially collect taxes for them and keep records of population size for them. The Mongol language is eventually committed to writing. In Chinggis Khan's time, it's only an oral language. Eventually, later in the 1200s, a number of Mongols figure out how to apply a Turkish alphabet in order to write down Mongol language in their own script. But the language of governance is not Mongolian. The Mongols, again, let the local leaders basically carry on the bureaucracy that's necessary to control populations in their own tongues. So Persian Muslims in the Middle East and largely northern Chinese Buddhists in that part of the empire use their own languages and their own local traditions of law and record keeping in order to keep their regions running and producing profits for their Mongol overlords. Garrisons of Mongol soldiers are settled at various areas around the empire, are granted pasture land for their horses, but ultimately this is an empire that runs on the display of military force, while really relying on its subjects to work for it in the hopes of not being further abused by the warrior class. Now, the one thing we can say about the Mongol imperialism in economic terms is that it generates the highest volume seen yet in Silk Road trade. For the first time since the Tang Dynasty, so it's been a few hundred years since the Silk Road was unified under the control of one imperial power, instead of having merchants pass through lots of different states along the way. You have the Silk Road belonging to the Mongol Empire of the Great Khans. And they recognize that merchants, whatever their ethnicity, whatever their religion, that merchants traveling the Silk Road can bring them goods and profits from abroad, and they can establish forts where merchants can be taxed. The Mongols make a rule that anyone can use the Silk Road to trade so long as they pay a sum to get a Silk Road passport from the local Mongol authorities. And if they show this passport at various places along the road and pay the proper fees, then they can travel anywhere along its length, essentially from Eastern Europe or the Middle East all the way to China and back again. This provides opportunities for merchants from the Middle East and parts of the Mediterranean world to have direct contact with the peoples of East Asia for the first time, really, in world history. This is the period in the Middle East and in Europe of the later Crusades. And it's a time period in which Europeans are starting to become more aware of the world beyond Europe's borders. So when the Mongol Empire reaches out to the west, it initially has a terrifying impact on the Europeans that it encounters, but gradually that starts to give way to economic possibilities. Now, the Mongol Empire, though, while it's encouraging trade and communication across the Asian continent, the Mongol Empire is, as we've said, politically divided. It's divided up between Chinggis Khan's 4 sons into 4 separate regions, each with its own Khan or king in charge. So we call each one of these regions Khanates. There are 4 of them. The most important comprises Mongolia itself, the Gobi Desert region, and northern China. Then if you go further west, you have the next one essentially along the Central Asian Silk Road. You go further northwest, and there's a Khanate in what's now Russia, what's now the western parts of Russia and Ukraine, which is known, nicknamed locally as the Golden Horde. And finally, if you go to the southwest, there's a Khanate that essentially takes up modern Afghanistan and Iran, a Khanate in Persia, which is known as the Ilkhanate. Now, these 4 Khanates at first are allied with one another. They're part of a federated Mongol empire. And the idea is that the Khan over all of the other Khans will be a sort of supreme emperor figure. For much of the history of the Mongol Empire, this great Khan is the one who's actually based in Mongolia and northern China. But eventually, over the later 1200s and the early 1300s, these Khanates inevitably begin fighting each other for territory and economic control. And so you start to get pockets of instability in parts of the empire, and it definitely does not have a strongly centralized government for much of its existence. Now, over time, again, each one of these Khanates has its own local objectives, local fortunes, and most of them do not last much longer than a century. So let's think about what happens in some of the different regions. In the area of Eastern Europe and Russia, there is another great push west by the Mongols in the early 1240s. The Mongol leaders of the Golden Horde region invade Eastern Europe. In the early 1240s, they seem to be continuing Chinggis Khan's plans of military conquest and trying to take as much territory as they can as pasture land for their horses and a source of slaves for their armies. They win a number of shocking military victories over armies of European knights that are mustered by their feudal lords and kings to try to stop them. A number of dukes and counts in what's now Poland and Eastern Germany, and a king in the region of Hungary along the Danube River muster their armies to try to send their knights and stop this threat from the east. and the Mongols literally ride circles around them. The European knights might have more armor, but the Mongols have more talented military leadership. They have a style of war that is faster moving and based on deception rather than codes of chivalric honor. And they very quickly surround these armies of European knights, draw them into traps, decimate their horses with arrows, and finally massacre them. It appears that nothing is capable of standing in the way of the Mongols. For a short time in the early 1240s, there's panic across Europe, and the fear that these nomadic riders, who are viewed as something like horsemen of the apocalypse, will ride all across Europe with nothing being able to check their advance. But suddenly, the invasion stopped and turned around, and most of the warriors rode back to Mongolia. What had happened was that the great Khan, one of Chinggis' sons, had died. All of the Mongol leaders are summoned back to Mongolia for a council to elect the new great Khan, and in the meantime, they cancel the European invasion. So the Mongols retain control of what's now Russia, but their soldiers pull back out of Poland and Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe. And there's a great sigh of relief as a few years pass and the Europeans realize that a Mongol conquest does not seem to be returning for the time being. Now that relief gives way to a sort of unjustified optimism in a number of different European circles. The early 1200s are a period in which the crusading movement of the High Middle Ages has now been drawing down in bloody failure. As you may remember from before the midterm exam, the Crusades had begun in the 1090s with the capture of Jerusalem by Western European Christians, especially from France and Germany. In the 1100s, the Muslim world had managed to unify more extensively against Crusader attacks and started to take back territories in the Levant. In the late 1100s, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, had recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders. And his heirs in the early 1200s are capturing one Crusader castle after another and basically driving Crusader forces back into the Mediterranean. Europe had, or Western Europe had, then failed to unify around new crusade movements. The Fourth Crusade had attacked the Byzantine Empire at Constantinople. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that the Muslim kingdom of Egypt is going to mop up all of the Crusader states and basically establish its own powerful empire and Muslim state across much of the Middle East. It's right at this period that the Mongol conquests take place and put the Mongols in touch with both the Muslim Middle Eastern world and the Christian European world. And under these circumstances, the Pope in Rome, a Pope named Innocent IV, decided as a sort of Hail Mary move to see if they could convert the Mongols to Christianity. He had heard that Mongols in Persia were also attacking the Muslim powers that the Crusaders were fighting against. And the Pope and his advisors came up with this plan. If we could show them the true light, if we could get them to see the light of Christianity, we could combine forces. We could redirect their violence against Ayyubid Egypt, against our Muslim enemies, and we could save Jerusalem and save the entire crusading movement. So a papal embassy is sent across the Silk Road to try to make contact with the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. They buy a passport, they get permission for a group of monks to pass through Golden Horde territory and then through the different territories of the different Khans. Finally, they make their way and they deliver a letter from the Pope to the great Khan in Mongolia. The great Khan, a ruler now named Munka, who was a grandson of Chinggis Khan, is not impressed. And he sends a famous message back in which he tells the Pope, I have no idea who you are. I don't know how you dare to speak to me as if you were my equal. I am the ruler of the world. And if you wish to get off easy, you will come in person to Mongolia and bow down before me, and maybe I won't enslave all your people. So it didn't go exactly as the Pope had planned. There was not going to be a grand alliance between the papacy and the Mongol Empire to revive the crusading movement. On the other hand, the embassy was allowed to depart and go back to Western Europe with their lives. They brought back an enormous amount of information about the customs of the Mongols and the territory of Eastern Asia, which had not been visited by a major European embassy to this date. And although the diplomatic effort came to absolutely nothing, this encouraged more and more European merchants to follow in the footsteps of that embassy and go out and trade with the powers of the East. This idea is taken up especially by merchants from the Mediterranean zone, especially from Italy, in the later 1200s and 1300s. This would be the backdrop for the famous travels of Marco Polo, one of the great merchant explorers of the late Middle Ages, who travels all the way to Mongol-controlled China and spends a long time at the Mongol court. So again, we have this period of greater contact between different parts of the world that comes out of the aftermath of the Mongol conquests. Now, in the Middle East, you also have some really fascinating developments in Mongol-occupied Persia, the so-called Ilkhanate. Under a grandson of Chinggis named Hulagu Khan, the Ilkhan Mongols expand west out of Persia, and they begin the conquest of the Muslim Middle East in the 1250s. They have a great deal of success. They capture the city of Baghdad, in particular, in the 1250s, and they kill the last Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and make Baghdad a garrison town for part of this western Mongol Khanate. They keep expanding further west towards the Mediterranean, and they actually do go into a direct war against Ayyubid Egypt. Although they do not establish a empire-wide Mongol alliance with the Pope in Rome, Mongol generals moving out of Persia and then Iraq do make local tactical pacts with a few crusader leaders who are still holding on to their castles in the Levant. And the Mongols under Hulagu Khan attempt to actually conquer the region around Jerusalem and push into Israel down towards the borders of Egypt. However, that would prove the ultimate limit of Mongol expansion in the West. In the year 1260, an army of Mongol warriors in Israel fights a battle against an army of Egyptian Muslims, and the Egyptians win. They manage to outfight and outshoot the Mongols in archery. They kill a Mongol general. This is called the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. And basically it shows that there are limits to what the Mongols can do. They're not completely invincible. So Egypt retains its empire in the western part of the Middle East. It would continue to conquer and finally take over what was left of the Crusader states, and would also extend its power to Arabia and to the Muslim religious centers of Medina and Mecca. The Mongols, for their part, and under Hulagu Khan, they would rule Persia and Iraq. They would actually convert to Islam themselves, becoming Sunni Muslims. And they would rely increasingly on a bureaucratic staff of Persian city governors and tax collectors to actually run their empire for them under the leadership of a small Mongol warrior elite. Now, back in Eastern Asia, we have a great deal of information about the one of the most famous of the later Mongol conquerors. Another grandson of Chinggis Khan is named Kublai Khan, and he's the ruler of Mongolia and northern China, especially in the 1250s to the 1270s. Kublai Khan completed Chinggis Khan's original plans by conquering and destroying the Song Chinese dynasty. He conquers southern China and all the fortresses of the Yangtze River Valley, and he brings all of China together again, unifying it under a harsh Mongol military occupation. The ethnic Chinese resent and hate their Mongol conquerors. The Mongols keep them down through force and terror. They try to dismantle various parts of the Chinese social system. They discriminate against ethnic Chinese while encouraging, again, migration by non-Chinese groups into Chinese territory. At the same time, Kublai Khan establishes his capital city at Hanbalik, the later Beijing, in northern China. He gives himself a Chinese dynasty name of the Yuan dynasty, and he tries to rule like an emperor of China, and tries to bring prosperity and wealth to the Mongol ruling class while occupying Chinese territory. Kublai Khan started a wave of other conquests. While and after he's finishing off resistance in southern China, he also sent Mongol armies further afield. They invade parts of what's now Tibet, they conquer northern Vietnam and Korea. The only place where Kublai Khan's armies are stopped is in the attempt to build a navy and sail out to the Japanese islands and bring those under Mongol control. There, 2 Mongol invasions of Japan are stopped in hard fighting on Japan's beaches by its samurai warriors, and then the Mongol ships are scattered to the winds by enormous typhoon storms, the so-called kamikaze or divine winds that the Japanese believed were miraculously sent to save them from Mongol attack. So Kublai Khan builds a successful, wealthy trading power in China over the resistance of the ethnic Chinese. Before we talk about China after the Mongols, we should say something briefly about the last of the major Mongol khanates. That's the one in the middle. We've talked about the west, we've talked about the east. There's also this Mongol state based in the Silk Road, based around what becomes its capital city at Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan. This is the region that's ruled, again, by another branch of Chinggis Khan's family. Ultimately, they go on the last sort of wave of Mongol conquests in the 1300s and early 1400s under a leader named Timur the Lame, or Timur Lenk, sometimes anglicized as Tamerlane. They launch a series of raids. They fight against other Mongol groups as well as non-Mongols. And in the early 1400s, Timur would actually manage to conquer northern India and Turkey and parts of the Russian and Persian khanates, as well as his own central territory. But ultimately, again, he would not manage to organize that into something that is really permanent and lasting, and it would break into lots of regional variants after his death. Now, in the 1300s, although there's this last wave of conquests under Timur, we see a gradual decline by the Mongol ruling classes after about a century. In many regions, they've relied on the locals to maintain a bureaucracy and tax system on their behalf. And basically, as time passes, the locals become better organized. They start to rise up and resist Mongol rule. And one after another in different regions, local rulers are able to overthrow the Mongols in the 1300s and establish their own local kingdoms. So by the middle of the 1300s in Persia, local Persian city leaders managed to band together and start to drive the Mongols out and establish a medieval Persian kingdom. In Russia, in the early 1300s, resistance to the Mongols is organized by a noble family called the Dukes of Moscow. And obviously, Moscow would have a significant importance in subsequent Russian history. The Grand Dukes there who managed to defeat Mongol forces in battle then establish a medieval Russian kingdom, which becomes the ancestor of the great Russian Empire. Now, in China, Again, in the middle of the 1300s, you start to see more and more resistance to Mongol rule. The ethnic Chinese population hates the Mongol occupiers. It's been brutalized by Mongol taxes and massacres of civilians, and a series of plagues had swept through the land. These probably include the bubonic plagues, which originated in the Chinese region and then spread to different Mongol khanates down the Silk Road, and would eventually spread in the great pandemic of the 1340s to the Middle East and to Europe. Now, this has been a bleak time in Chinese history, but in the 1360s, there's finally a successful rebellion against Mongol rule. It's led by someone who originates as a peasant and bandit chief named Zhu Yuanzhang. He ends up being able to defeat the Mongols in southern China, drive them out of the Yangtze region, and eventually, in 1368, he captures the Mongol capital at Khan Balik, chases them out, and establishes his power and resurrects ethnic Chinese authority across China. The Mongols themselves are driven back into the Gobi Desert and into Mongolia to the north. And the leader of this rebellion then establishes a new dynasty. He takes the emperor name of Hongwu and establishes the Ming dynasty that would last from the 1300s to the 1600s in China. A feature of Ming dynasty rule is a continuation of long-term warfare against the remnants of the Mongol khanates to the north, and especially against Timur's Central Asian Mongols to the west. The Ming dynasty is strong enough to retake China proper, but not strong enough to conquer all of the different Mongol groups and take over the whole Mongol Empire. The Ming emperor is definitely not strong enough with his armies to retake the Silk Road at the height of Timur's power. So the Ming emperors have to look elsewhere to try to rebuild China's economic prosperity. Traditionally, successful Chinese dynasties have controlled the Silk Road, yet this does not seem a possibility. And therefore, under the Ming dynasty, by the early 1400s, Ming rulers start to think outside the box. And they start to imagine China as a great economic power based not on overland trade, the Silk Road, but instead on the building of a great ocean-going fleet, a navy, and the possibility that they could use that navy to trade overseas with the rest of the world and project Chinese power abroad. So the Ming Emperor Yonglei, in the early 1400s, entrusted a court secretary, a Muslim eunuch named Zhang He, with the task of building a massive navy and treasure fleet, and exploring the coasts of Asia and beyond, and finding a way to bring trade and treasure and diplomatic contact from China to the world's other peoples, while bypassing, outflanking their Mongol enemies. Zhang He would become one of the most famous maritime explorers in world history. He led 7 great voyages from 1405 to 1433, more than a half century before Columbus. Just one of Zhang He's treasure ships had a much greater carrying capacity than all 3 of Columbus's ships put together. His fleet comprised more than 60 treasure ships and more than 200 warships, and they sailed wherever they could. They sailed down to the Philippines, they sailed into Indonesia and New Guinea, they sailed to the various islands and coastal ports of Southeast Asia, and then to India, to the Persian Gulf, to Arabia, and down the east coast of Africa, where they trade with a growing network of Muslim city-states in the Swahili region of what's now Kenya and Tanzania. They bring back enormous amounts of goods to China while depositing Chinese trade goods in East Africa and the Middle East. They establish this possible route to China's world influence as the great exploring naval power. But the phase of Chinese naval exploration is short-lived. Yonglei, the emperor who patronized the great fleet-building missions, died in the 1420s, and his son believed that the fleets were a distraction, that China should be spending its money on making the Great Wall greater and fighting directly against the Mongols to the west. So he draws down funding for the fleet. He temporarily cancels voyages, finally lets Zheng He go out one more time to sea, but Zheng He dies on that voyage in 1433. And after that, the Ming emperors cancel all further naval exploration. They take the funds that they do have and pour them into their wall. And it's in the Ming period that the Great Wall, as we know it today, is completed in northern China. But China here throws away the opportunity for naval contact with the rest of the world. China would enter, by the early modern period, an age of relative isolation from the west of the world. At the same time, the Europeans have become acquainted with the wealth that could be gained through trade over long distances with China. And when the powers of Western Europe in the late Middle Ages realize that the Silk Road corridor has been broken, that direct overland trade with China is difficult or impossible, they start to look for other trade routes by sea themselves. And this is going to play into the European age of exploration.